The morning sky over Denver was flawless, painted in shades of gold and blue that promised a routine flight. Captain Daniel Reeves completed his pre-flight checks with the same methodical precision he'd used for 23 years, first in the Air Force and now with Continental Airways. Flight 782 to Seattle carried 146 souls, businessmen reviewing presentations, families heading to reunions, a young couple on their honeymoon. Daniel exchanged brief words with his co-pilot, Michael Torres, a capable officer with 8 years of experience. The passengers settled into their seats, completely unaware that the man in the cockpit had flown combat missions in 2 wars and had seen things most pilots never would. As the Boeing 737 lifted smoothly into the morning air, Daniel felt the familiar comfort of a plane responding perfectly to his commands. This was his 4,287th flight, and he had no reason to expect it would be anything but ordinary. 30 minutes into the flight, cruising at 33,000 feet over the Rockies, the world exploded. A deafening bang, like a cannon firing inside a metal box, shook the entire aircraft, followed immediately by violent shuddering that threw loose objects into the aisle. Daniel's training kicked in before his conscious mind could process what was happening. Left engine failure, catastrophic by the sound and the immediate loss of thrust. But the instruments told a worse story. The engine hadn't just failed, it had disintegrated, and shrapnel had torn through the wing structure. The aircraft immediately began rolling left, fighting against Daniel's control inputs like a wild animal. Warning alarms screamed from every panel, a cacophony of disasters all demanding attention simultaneously. Michael's face went white as he stared at the gauges, all of them spinning into red zones, and he shouted the words every pilot dreads: "We're losing control." Behind them in the passenger cabin, oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling as the rapid descent triggered the emergency systems, and 146 people began to understand that something had gone terribly, impossibly wrong. Daniel's hands moved across the controls with mechanical efficiency, trying every standard procedure to level the aircraft, but nothing was working. The asymmetric thrust from the remaining engine was pulling them into an unrecoverable spin. The Denver control tower's voice cut through the chaos, calm but urgent. "Flight 782, you are in an uncontrolled descent. You have 19 seconds to stabilize the aircraft." 19 seconds. The words hit Daniel like ice water. 19 seconds was a death sentence in aviation terms. Barely enough time to think, let alone execute a recovery. The altimeter was unwinding at a terrifying rate, the ground rushing up through the clouds below, mountains that would shred the aircraft into fragments. Michael was running through the emergency checklist, his voice cracking with stress, but Daniel could see in his peripheral vision that his co-pilot's hands were shaking. This wasn't a simulation where you could reset and try again. This was real, and 146 people were about to die unless he did something that had never been done before in a situation like this. The aircraft rolled past 45 degrees, passengers screaming, luggage breaking free from overhead bins, and Daniel felt time compress into a single crystalline moment of absolute clarity. What Daniel did next would later be studied in aviation schools as either genius or madness, depending on who was teaching. Instead of trying to power through the spin with the remaining engine, the textbook approach that would fail because the asymmetry was too extreme, he did something no manual recommended and few pilots would have the nerve to attempt. He cut power to the functioning engine entirely. For 3 seconds, both engines were dead, and the aircraft became a glider falling through thin air at 33,000 feet, and Michael actually gasped, "What are you doing?" in pure terror. But Daniel had seen this principle work in combat when his fighter jet lost hydraulics over Baghdad. Remove the asymmetric force, let the aircraft find its natural equilibrium, then use the aerodynamic surfaces and gravity itself to regain control. The spin began to slow as the opposing forces neutralized each other, and Daniel used the momentary stability to deploy the speed brakes and adjust the trim, bleeding off the rotational energy. Then, with a precision that came from thousands of hours in the cockpit, he restarted the right engine at exactly the moment when the aircraft's nose was pointing skyward at the correct angle. The engine roared back to life. Thrust returned, and the Boeing began, incredibly, impossibly, to level out. They had fallen 8,000 feet in less than a minute, but they were flying again, and Daniel allowed himself one breath before addressing the next crisis. They were still 180 miles from the nearest suitable airport with only one engine and unknown structural damage to the wing. Daniel's voice came through the intercom, steady and calm despite everything that had just happened, explaining to the passengers that they had experienced an engine failure, but the situation was under control and they would be making an emergency landing. He didn't mention that the wing was damaged, that they were flying on borrowed time, or that he had just performed a maneuver that had never been attempted on a commercial aircraft at that altitude. The Denver Tower had already scrambled emergency services to Grand Junction Regional Airport, the closest facility that could handle a 737, and Daniel began the careful descent, nursing the single engine, constantly adjusting for the drag from the damaged wing. Michael had regained his composure and was working through the landing checklist, but when they attempted to deploy the landing gear, only 2 of the 3 indicators showed green. The nose gear was stuck. Daniel closed his eyes for just a moment, calculating the odds, the angles, the speed they'd need to touch down on the main gear and keep the nose up as long as possible before it dropped. They had one approach, one chance, because they didn't have the fuel or the engine power for a go-around. As the runway came into view through the windscreen, lined with foam and emergency vehicles, Daniel's hands were perfectly steady on the controls. He'd been preparing for this moment his entire career, even if he'd never known it until now. The touchdown was brutal but controlled. The main landing gear hit the foam-covered runway with a screech of tortured metal and rubber, and Daniel fought to keep the aircraft centered as it decelerated, the damaged wing wanting to pull them off course. He held the nose up as long as physics would allow, using every ounce of his strength on the controls, but eventually gravity won and the nose dropped hard, grinding along the runway in a shower of sparks and the sound of tearing aluminum. The aircraft skidded, shuddered, and for a terrifying moment seemed like it might cartwheel, but Daniel's tiny corrections on the rudder kept them straight, kept them together, until finally, after what felt like an eternity compressed into 30 seconds, the Boeing 737 came to rest 200 feet from the end of the runway. The cabin was silent except for the sound of emergency alarms and the hiss of fire suppression foam. Then someone started crying, and it spread like a wave through the aircraft as people realized they were alive, they were on the ground, they had survived. Daniel sat motionless in his seat, hands still on the controls, Michael beside him with tears streaming down his face. Emergency crews were already swarming the aircraft, deploying slides, evacuating passengers who stumbled out onto the runway and fell to their knees kissing the ground. Not a single life had been lost, not even a serious injury beyond some broken bones and bruises from the rough landing.